Hey, this is Jack, and this video is called The World's on Fire. What can you do? So this is a different kind of video than I normally make. My intention in making this video is to share some things that from my personal experience have been useful to me in being with what is happening at large in the world. I'm not saying to you that I'm right about this stuff. I'm not saying to you that you need to take on my perspectives. I'm just sharing some stuff that may help you find more ease and grace and peace in being with what is happening at large. And when I say that, I mean, there's so many things we could say about what is happening at large. I mean a list that includes extreme cultural polarization, an increased inability for left-wing and right-wing groups to hear each other in any kind of civil way, extreme events in our climate, and maybe just to say a baseline sense, obviously a global pandemic, and a sense of a lot of people that it's an unsettling time, and a lot of people are worried and fearful about what's going on and what direction we're headed. So my intention is to try and help with that in some small way by offering a few ideas that may be of service, or maybe even just some perspectives that I don't see are necessarily included in the conversation, right? So the first thing you can do, and this does relate to what I talk to on this channel a lot, is to not subjectify. Not subjectify. So just quickly, if that's not a phrase that you're familiar with, to subjectify or subjectification, it means to imagine that someone else is more similar than you, or should be more similar to you than they actually are. It also, when I subjectify, I might imagine that I understand why you do or say a certain thing. And so when I subjectify, I tend to dial down my own curiosity, and I might live within assumptions that I'm not even acknowledging that I'm living within about you. You know, you should think this, you should do that, you should feel this, you should behave in a certain way. Now, this is a really useful practice for being in friendship or intimate relationship. Anytime you have a one-to-one relationship with someone, work colleagues, clients, customers, it's really useful to not subjectify them. You'll have an easier time being with them and being with your own experience of them when you're in minimum narrative about who it is they are or who it is that they should be. And by the way, this also has kickbacks to ourselves, right? When we have minimum narrative about who we are and who we should be, we tend to live more easily, right? We tend to get our inner critics off our backs. We tend to be more okay that we evolve and change. Who I was a year, 5, 10 years ago is not who I am now. What I thought then doesn't have to be what I think now. What I thought was important in life doesn't have to be what I think and feel is important in life now. And by the way, the more I can do that for me, the more I can get off my own back and allow myself to be who I really am without judgment, without too much shoulding. Of course, it's then easier to do for other people, right? We tend to not extend that courtesy to other people when we can't do it for ourselves. So that's really useful in relationship, in intimate relationship. Also, it's useful in understanding that people are having different experiences of life, and people have different ways of coping and understanding and making meaning from their different experiences of life, right? So just because somebody is acting or behaving in a particular way doesn't mean that they're doing it for the same reason that you would, right? If someone's being defensive or critical, doesn't mean they're doing it for the same reason that you would. Sometimes someone's being defensive or critical because that's just the best that they can do, right? And that maybe there's a way that with extreme practice, we can bring our compassion rather than just our counter defensiveness, right? Or our critique. This is really useful in intimate relationship, by the way, because any of us, when we're close to people at times, we're going to get short, we're going to be, off our center, we're going to be triggered. And it can be really useful to learn how not to escalate a trigger with your own counter trigger, like I'm triggered because you're triggered, rather than like, okay, I might be contracting or I might feel anxious that you're triggered, but I'm going to do my best to stay present. So at large, it can be easy to subjectify people because, we imagine that if they don't drive a certain type of renewable energy car, or if they don't recycle, or if they don't do certain practices, it must mean that they don't care, right? Rather than perhaps getting curious about, well, what is their experience? What do they care about? What are they putting emphasis on? Right? Because nearly everyone in my experience, and this in some ways brings us on to point number 2, nearly everyone in my experience cares about something. And normally they care about many things. And sometimes when they are not agreeing with you or not prioritizing a certain value that you have, it might be because they are caring about and valuing something else. So point number 2 is, how can we expand our values? How can we expand our values? How can we learn how to value more things, right? It's this sort of a maybe a higher level of development maneuver in some ways, because for a lot of us, the initial big step is actually clarifying and communicating what our values are, right? And I remember this, as a kind of wide-eyed young social entrepreneur, being very proud that these are the values of our organization, going into business meetings, and we'd, here's our values and mission. What are your values and mission, right? And that's a really great way to be in the world. What you may notice at a certain point in time is that is also limited, right? These are my values, and so therefore by implication, or even just maybe by unconscious awareness, these things are not my values. These things I don't value. And it might just be true, right? Some of us value nature more than others. Some of us value reading more than others, right? That's totally legit. But when it comes to wanting to find common ground with someone, when it comes to wanting to extend more and more people into your circle of concern, or even just understanding more and more people, one of the things you can do is to learn to value what it is they're valuing. And the first step to that is actually just to be able to identify it, right? So rather than this is a bad person, or this person is misguided or ill-informed, or fill in some kind of other critique or expletive, what is the thing that this person's valuing, right? It might even just be their own sense of safety or their own sense of belonging, right? All of us have that at some level. All of us, in my experience, most all of us, if our sense of safety is challenged enough, we're not going to be at our best, and we might even be at our worst, right? If we really feel backed into a corner, or we feel safe, or we're just completely overwhelmed, it's hard for us to respond in our most positive, generous, and generative ways. So sometimes what you even might just notice is, that person is valuing their own sense of survival, right? Their own sense of security. Maybe what they're valuing is their sense of tradition or history, or their sense of roots. Maybe what they're valuing is keeping things the same. And, as someone who's historically leaned much more on the progressive side, it was difficult for me historically to value, why would someone want to conserve things that aren't fair, things that don't work, things that to the entrepreneur in me have obvious gaping challenges that we could solve? Why would someone want to value that? Maybe someone values that partly because it's not even a choice, right? One way you can think about our values is a bit like taste buds. If there's a sour taste in your mouth, it's your taste buds that deal with that taste that notice it. Those taste buds can't actually notice other tastes, right? They can't actually notice sweet or salty. That's not their job. So in the world that acknowledges that we have different systems, we have different capacities, we have different things that we value, some of that is not just because I'm choosing to value this particular thing, it's just kind of, that's how I'm built, right? Or that's the thing that, certainly before I bring it to more awareness, that's the thing that I'm going to be valuing. So for me, learning how to appreciate people that have conservative values that I wasn't raised in, values that didn't make sense to me in my college years, values that it would be easy just to dismiss coming from a more progressive perspective, learning how to actually notice, okay, there's something that they're valuing. I might not value that thing at all. I might not even know how to notice how to value that thing. I haven't had any value on upholding traditions, for example. But maybe I can expand myself enough to notice that might be really important to you. Maybe even over time, I can notice the part of me that can appreciate and value that, right? Just like I'm not a big wine drinker, but my understanding is that over time, your palate can start to appreciate more flavors. Like initially, you might not really appreciate a fine wine. You might not be able to distinguish, or, let's say something I was a bit more skilled at. I learned languages a lot in my younger years. And there are certain sounds that if you're not a native speaker can be really difficult, not only to say, but to even hear. I remember sitting for hours in the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, in French-speaking Switzerland, trying to hear the difference between and and I couldn't hear it. I just listened to these tapes and they'd say these two different words and I'd just be hearing the same word and the same word. Over time of practicing, one day I was like, oh, I can hear it. I can't reproduce it, but I can hear it. And once you can hear it, and I might not even be saying it accurately in the way that I was reproducing it earlier, once you can hear it, it's a little bit easier to then speak it. So if you can appreciate, notice, okay, what is this person fighting for? What is this person valuing? What is they protecting? I'm not doing that from a place of you should value something different or you should value what I value. Let me just put me down for a moment and kind of open up to you and notice, what is it that you're valuing? What is it that you're paying attention to? What is it that you're needing? And what you might come to see is that people are valuing and paying attention to and needing quite different things. And when I get that, I might have a bit more compassion and understanding, where previously I might just have judgment, or I might just think you are limited, silly, stupid, unevolved. You can fill in the blanks. It can easily be this unconscious superiority because I actually haven't taken the time to get into your reality enough. Like if I was living, it's like the walk a mile in someone's shoes. If it's true that we're all having a unique experience of life, in some ways I'm never going to know what your life experience is, right? You can tell me about it, but even your ability to put it through words and for me to hear it through words, like, will I really get it? Will I really get the actual physical embodied experience of living your life through your particular mind body, through your particular piece of consciousness? It's unlikely. So we're always just approximating, right? Just in the same way that language is an approximation for an object or experience. We're always doing our best just to get an approximation of where someone stands. So the best is, I think, is to be able to lead with some kind of compassion and humility. And they can sound like, big values that I'm just throwing around. And it's actually hard to do what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking from the school of hard knocks, of having friends that I like and appreciate, and realizing, wow, in certain ways we have such a difference of political view. Is it possible for me to stay in the conversation long enough to get what it is that you're talking about and why you're talking about it and why you value it? And historically, I probably wasn't very good at that. I can remember even as a Brit starting to spend time in America, talking to someone and then them saying in the middle of a conversation, well, obviously the only way to to deal with bad guys with a gun is to have good guys with a gun. And in that moment, being really surprised. That's just not a perspective that is part of any real British political discourse. Not really knowing what to do with that. Like feeling like, wow, that's a very different perspective. And initially maybe not even being curious, being kind of shocked and having to deal with my own shock about that. That is happening ongoingly in our political discourse right now. Certainly in the least civil end of that discourse. It's also, for a lot of us, it happens in our relationships, right? There's a moment where you're like, oh wow, I thought we were on the same page about that. We're actually not. Oh, I thought that when you said you valued this, family, or we value, health, like I have a particular vision for that, probably based on my own vision and my own experience. So we might value the same thing, but the vehicle we're using is really different. So I'm trying to point to this, in a world of authenticity, there's so much individuality in a certain way, right? There's so much nuance to how you hold something, to, how your soul is embodied in this physical plane, to your lived experience, your upbringing, your projections, your wounds, your defenses. There's a lot of complexity to being a human being. So learning how to listen from that place of minimum assumption, maximum curiosity, kind of putting myself, I use the expression putting myself down. Obviously don't mean in a self-deprecating way. I mean just kind of like, if there's a me that has a lot of thoughts and is kind of in my own reality, it's like I take that garment off as best I can and kind of put that down. So I'm starting with a little bit more of a blank slate, realizing we may even be using some words that the way you use it and the way I use it is different, right? There's this thing, and one of the main things I remember from my 3 years of university studies is a thing called essentially contested concepts. And it basically means you take something like democracy, what you mean by democracy and what I mean by democracy might just be two different things. So it's hard for us to even start in the same place, right? Let alone you and I have an experience together, like in the sense that, let's say we have a conflict, right? And we're on different sides of this conflict. How you and I have interpreted that experience, how we remember it, how our memory encodes it, it's going to be different. And that doesn't mean to say that I'm right and you're wrong, or you're right and then I'm wrong, right? It's that we're both fallible, we're both limited, we're both groping to apprehend as much truth as we can. And if we remember the fragility of our own groping, it's easier to remember the fragility of someone else's groping, right? So this also brings me then on to point 3 here, which is, it's something I've come across more recently, but it sort of resonates with, I think, ideas that have been in me for a long time. Like, don't judge people. I do my best when I don't judge people by their worst 15 minutes, right? So, you can look at reaction videos on YouTube, and I know reaction videos are kind of fun. You can see someone that's like filming someone who's, lost their temper or is being antisocial, or fill in the blanks. You and I have probably all had some kind of moments like that, right? Our own self-serving bias is going to have those things recede in our memories. Our own self-serving bias is going to say, yeah, but when that happened, it was justified, right? Because I know why I did it, or why I got triggered, or why I was angry, right? So nearly all of us, even if we watch it, are going to have some kind of self-serving bias. And when we're watching someone having a meltdown on YouTube, we're also having a cup of tea, sat at home, probably feeling a little bit safer and more secure in that moment perhaps than the person that was caught on camera. So it's not about exonerating bad behavior so much as, just imagining, if someone is triggered, I'm not going to hear the full truth from that person, right? I'm going to hear the truth that their triggered self can reproduce, right? And their triggered self may also be age regressed, right? Now I may be a teenager, I may be my toddler's online, maybe my 6-year-old, any combination of those. So I'm not going to be talking from my adult, resourced, whole creative adult self. And so just cutting ourselves some slack that when we're triggered, right, our toolbox is going to start to shrink, and the same thing is going to happen with someone else. So, if you look at someone in politics and, maybe under pressure, they say a certain thing, or it's like, we've all said stuff. We've all said something impulsively or in anger that we later regret, or we've all had days where we're just kind of in a mood and we take it out on someone, or we take it out on, the parking meter, or we shout at the TV, or we cuss in the shower, or we, whatever those things are, right? And if you're not ever in touch with any anger, that's its own problem, right? That's its own spiritual bypass for most of us. So it's kind of looking at the world. Rumi said, I'll meet you in the field beyond right and wrong. Right? This is inviting a meeting in the world beyond the narrative of good and bad, right? Hero and villain. Most of us love that. It's like one of the great archetypical narratives, right? Hero, villain, someone needing to be rescued. We talk about that as the drama triangle, right? That there's, a hero, a villain, a rescuer. That's a certain way of experiencing life. Right? That either, you're in one of those roles, and that can be true to a particular scenario. It's just, if that's your default and often unconscious lens, you're always looking for, well, who's right and who's wrong, and who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. I think we miss that we have all of that within us, right? That we have, quote, a good guy and a bad guy within us, right? We have a resourced one and a triggered one within us. We have a hero and a villain within us. So we can start to transcend that narrative and realize, oh, yeah, in some moments, if you saw me in my worst 15 minutes, you wouldn't be very impressed. If I saw you in your worst 15 minutes, I might find that hard, right? Or you would find it hard that if I judged you ongoingly, my view of you was based upon your worst 15 minutes, that might be really, really, really tragic, right? Because I might miss all this love and light and compassion and goodness and truth and beauty that you bring into the world. And it's saying that most of us have a mixed scorecard, right? Not all scorecards are equal, perhaps, but most of us have some kind of mixed scorecard. Better days, worse days, not in a mood, was in a mood, high energy, low energy, seasons of expansiveness, seasons of contraction, transitions, letting go of things, staying attached to things, staying in relationships too long, not getting into a relationship, not understanding that a relationship was actually just a lovership. I mean, there's so much that goes into understanding who we are in this life. The evolving understanding of that. And what's happening in this time, in my view, is that some of the larger cultural narratives about who we are coming under stress. And that is disorienting, even whilst it might be the mechanism of our collective growth, right? Oftentimes, collective narratives have to recede or die or shift in order for something better to come online. But as that happens, it's really uncomfortable, right? If the thing that you've always taken to be true suddenly isn't true, right? Or the place you've always gone to find true information, suddenly there's now, wow, this kind of, there's a lack of clarity about this information. Was this information generated by a human? Was it generated by a robot? Was this information generated on the basis of a specific political agenda? Has that agenda been announced, or is it not announced? To what extent can we get access to objective information? Even the use of, and this brings me on to point 4, acknowledging that the truth itself is an essentially contested concept, right? So a lot of what is upsetting people about the world is like, wow, we can't even agree on what is true news and fake news, right? So there's going to be so much complexity to that question that I haven't metabolized for sure. Part of that question is that there are forces, sort of knowingly and unknowingly, that might be creating fake news, right? So there are forces in the sense we know that fake news gets more of an emotive reaction from the lower parts of our brain, so it's more viral. So there's incentives for people to create that kind of news, right? So we know that, and we know that there's political memes created in the States by people, teens sitting in their bedrooms in, Southeastern Europe, right? That is happening in the world. But if you just sort of put that aside and say, when someone talks about the truth, there are many things that they can mean by that, right? So just simplistically, historically, one way that people thought about truth was sort of truth by authority, right? Truth from an authority figure, whether that's a head of a nation, whether that's a head of a church, whether that's certain texts that we hold to be authoritative. That was the main way that truth was sort of either as a kind of divine truth, or something's true because someone I trust, even if that's just my doctor, has told me that that's true, right? And that's a different way of talking about what's true from a kind of scientific view of what's true, which is, can we over time repeat experiments that give us certain results that we can all observe, and therefore over time we come to hold those things to be true. Sort of some kind of more objective way of talking about truth. And then there's a way of talking about truth which is my personal truth. Here's my truth, here's my experience. I am the authority on my subjective experience. I know what I'm experiencing inside to the extent that I can accurately discern it, to the extent that I can accurately communicate it. I know more about my inner states. I know more about my inner thoughts than anyone. So I can talk about this is true for me. This is true in my experience. Now, sometimes when we say this is true in that way, we leave off the this is true in my experience. We leave off the this is true for me, or this is true in this moment. It can be useful to re-include that. The challenge is, if someone's not in an orientation to reality where there is any room for a personal truth, right? If truth is just the truth, there's no room for, well, your experience of what's true, or my experience of what's true, or maybe we could even use a different word and just drop saying, this is true in my experience, just say, in my experience, in my lived experience, in my subjective experience right now, in my feelings, in my body. But sometimes we don't talk that way, right? So now we've got a cultural polarization between different sources of truth, right? The truth from authority, the truth from science, and personal truth. And sometimes those things are just getting undistinguished. And so, of course, if you want your truth to come from science, and I'm talking about my personal truth, why would you have any time to listen to me? Why would that make any sense to you? If that's not a language that you would ever use about yourself, or a way of orienting to reality that has any validity, right? Because partly that's about stages of development, levels of consciousness. There's a way, this is one of the great sort of achievements, depending how you look at it, of postmodernism, is an inclusion of subjective experience, right? And that might sound like a big fancy phrase, postmodernism, subjective experience. Basically, my personal truth, what is true to me, or what I'm feeling, or what I'm experiencing, becomes important. If I'm looking purely through the lens of what is important and true is what we can observe and test repeatedly in science, why would I care at all about what you feel? or about how you've experienced something, or what your internal world is about something, right? So from that perspective, whether something is just is about whether, justice in an observable sense has been delivered, right? Whether something has been, put through the courts and had a trial by jury and due process has been observed, which is important, obviously. But whether that's my internal experience that justice was served, that's a different question, right? I might feel like, oh yeah, it was. I might feel like, oh no, it wasn't. But if you don't have any validity that you give to my subjective experience, you're not going to care how I feel, right? So this expression that I hear a lot on YouTube and in political conversation, like, the facts don't care about your feelings. I think it's almost different levels of consciousness, different ways of experiencing reality at a kind of deep level that are in contradiction there, right? Is it true that certain facts are hard about life and that those facts of life don't seem to change whether I like them or not? Yes, that might be true. Is it true that feelings don't matter? Absolutely not, in my experience. Feelings do matter, right? It's not necessarily that the feelings are always going to change every piece of observable data in the world, but how I or a large group of people feel about something has consequences, right? And the more that I give myself permission to notice what I feel authentically, the more easy it's going to be for me to be curious about, well, what do you feel authentically about this? And it is actually inviting us just to get out of a world that's run by our heads alone. Worlds run by our heads alone was a huge developmental achievement, right? In the sense, rather than just appealing to, I have to accept what you say because you're king, right? So what the king says is true, right? That maybe wasn't going to be the most conscious way of all of us being in the world, right? So the developmental achievement that says there are observable things that we can, as a community, have some consensus that when A happens, B is the result, and we can agree on that. That has been a huge developmental achievement, really the initiation into a rational world, right? That the rationality matters. The challenge is that rationality isn't the only or always best game in town. Having zero rationality is a problem, but only rational might, for some of us, start to be experienced as limited because we actually want to be closer to our experience, closer to our feelings, closer to our individuated path, bring in such things as personal truth, be in our bodies. So we actually want something that's, what some people describe as post-rational. The challenge is, to someone that's rational, post-rational is not going to make any sense. And what is it going to look like in the sort of big irony of the universe? It's going to look like something that's pre-rational, right? So we call this the pre-trans fallacy. It's like a fancy phrase, but it basically means something that's post-rational and pre-rational. So something that's, say, superstition, which is sort of the realm of pre-rational thinking, is going to look kind of similar than you saying, well, here's my truth, and you need to hear my truth. It's like, no, we're kind of good with the science and good with the facts. I don't really care how you feel. And there's huge amounts of energy being expended over this because we have a clash of worldviews, right? Clash of worldviews, clash of levels of reality, clash of levels of consciousness, however you think of that. There is these sort of bigger structures that are bigger than any of us, worldviews that are clashing, like a traditional worldview, a scientific rational worldview, and a sort of post-rational subjective worldview that are very poor bedfellows. It's really hard. I remember, spending hours and hours and hours and hours in my earlier life trying to have sort of arguments in some ways across these worldviews. They go nowhere in my experience. How do we get out of that? Is the move to being able to see, there's maybe these different worldviews. They maybe all have some validity. And actually, if I in myself can hold a place where I can value what's rational whilst I also value your subjective experience, and I'm not trying to pit them against each other. I'm just saying they're both included. And I can value what someone who's, really adheres to a traditional life that was handed down to them by their family or by their culture or by their nation, and they really value that. I can also value that at the same time, right? So this is what we call becoming a more integrated human being, is that we can take different types of perspectives or different types of worldview, and we can learn how to value them and stop subjectifying people, saying, well, surely you should be thinking the way that I think, right? Or surely even this, the expression, you should be outraged is a form of subjectification. It might be an effective political and social tool. So let's include that. But the notion that every person should feel exactly the same thing when they see the same thing, that doesn't seem true to me based upon my experience of coaching people and being human and noticing people attend to very different things. People get triggered by very different things, right? A lot of people get triggered by the current US president. Some people don't. That's going to be a lot based on their views, their perspectives, their worldviews, their experience, what they're prioritizing, what they're paying attention to, how they hold things. Are they more of an emotionally reactive person? Are they more of a non-emotionally reactive person? I mean, there's a lot of nuance in there, right? So I guess if I'm just going to round out what I'm trying to say here, I think there's a role for those of us that can start to, within ourselves, find these different places, find these different social and political and cultural values, find space for what is a personal truth alongside what might be a more scientific or objective truth, and include all of that. In a sense, that is where I think this is going, right? On the other side of the cultural polarization, right? On the other side of why is this so difficult? On the other side of a breakdown of discourse, of massive mistrust, of, people on the right wing, people on the left wing, of this sort of, everyone calling everyone fake news, everyone assuming everyone has bad intentions. On the other side of that, I think there's a place within more of us where we can hold all of these things. And when that happens, it sort of dissolves some of the tensions, right? Because it's like, oh, I can appreciate what you're appreciating. I can also appreciate what you're appreciating. And I don't necessarily have to define myself so much in these categories like, oh, because I'm a left-wing person, everything that you say over there I have to disagree with, right? That we can sort of relax the tribal mentality around that and actually get to be with more things, right? That is what it is when as an individual, when we're dealing with our own shadows, we're doing an inclusive move. How can I include more of the things that I habitually keep out of my awareness that might actually be true about me, even though that's massively inconvenient and I might have some shame about it? In the same way as a collective, it's like, how as a collective can we own more things and more perspectives, and not just the ones that we easily have compassion for, right? Not just the causes that we feel drawn to, or the cultural narratives that we feel drawn to. How can we be with the ones that we really don't understand and imagine that there might be something of value in there, right? There's this expression in the integral community, no one's 100% wrong. And what it means is there's normally something of value in every perspective, right? That someone is valuing something, even as they're perhaps being rude to you, or even as they're being completely triggered, or even as they seem to be talking badly. There might be something they're valuing that if I can notice that and align with it, it might be easier to build a bridge or to include them rather than having to exclude them, right? The more that we can include people, the more we can be a collective, even one that has huge disagreements and differences about how it wants to proceed, right? Rather than the thing just, completely fragmenting. There may be more fragmentation before there is more of the integration that I'm talking about. So I'm not saying this is at large going to be happening next week, but if you want to play your part in it, or you just want to have a little bit more ease with what is unfolding, some of these perspectives may help you. I know I've been quite kind of technical and out there with some of my language. Leave me a comment here. If you've watched this far, like this video, please. Obviously, subscribe to the channel if you haven't. But I'd love you to leave a comment and just let me know, are you picking up what I'm putting down? Is it making any sense? Am I losing you? Or there's some of this that you get? Could you see how some of this is valuable? I would love to know, because it'd be really helpful for me in terms of dialing in how I can be helpful to you. So as always, I'm Jack. Thank you so much for being here.